Good morning, or rather good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Uspaman Mhlongo, Senior Programs Officer at the Democracy Development Program, and we would like to welcome you to our session regarding the state of local government at the moment. And particularly in this session, we want to try and forecast to what the future looks like, 2021 and beyond. As we're aware, we're doing this in the context of both COVID-19, the resultant lockdowns that have affected everyone in society, but particularly also looking at what the effect then is for the ways in which governance happens at the local government level, but also what the effect of this might be on civic and voter education and ultimately the casting of ballots in the 2021 elections. We would like to profusely, firstly, issue an apology for the technical difficulties that you may have experienced in trying to engage with our second webisode for the day, which was looking specifically at public participation and political legitimacy, especially as we exist within this process, this period, where there have been some instances of by-elections that had to be postponed. But of course, we did hear last week from the IEC itself that the elections, the by-elections were held really well over the course of the 11th of November. And we want to be able to engage now on what the future prospects look like in relation to this. As I said, my name is Uspaman Mhlongo, and I'll be moderating today's session. And we have with us two very proficient speakers, both in terms of the girth of knowledge that they have, but also in terms of the experience that they would have in the sector that we're engaging on. First off, we have Dr. Kambule from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who will be providing us with his look at some of the intentions for reform at local government that have been spoken about quite significantly. We've been hearing that at the moment, the Minister of COGTA, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, is currently engaged in the process of sensitization of the district development model that she's looking at. And in this section, Dr. Kambule will also be providing us with a brief context of co-production and decentralization, looking at what ought to we engaged with in order to attempt to improve local government outcomes. And then we have with us, luckily for us, a very high-ranking member of the IEC. We're very glad to have her with us. She had engaged in a number of other meetings today, but was able to afford us the opportunity to engage with her. Jeanette Love. Jeanette Love is the Vice Chairperson and a Commissioner at the Independent Electoral Commission, and we would like to welcome her. And she'll be speaking, giving us a brief overview for her and the IEC in terms of the work that's gone in, firstly, into preparing for the by-elections that occurred under the level 1 of lockdown and what the implications of having postponed those by-elections from happening earlier on in the year, as we do know that the pandemic is ongoing. And then first, also forecasting in terms of the broad reaching campaign of voter and civic education that the IEC is constantly engaged in, specifically also looking at preparation for the 2021 local government elections. And we hope that we will be able to glean a lot more from that perspective. A reminder that the chat section is available. You can engage with us via the chat. And furthermore, should you have any questions to any of the panelists, you are welcome to use the chat function. We'll also be launching a poll shortly to gauge your thoughts on a number of issues, and we'd like you to engage with us on that perspective. I'd like to welcome both of the speakers and then hand over to Dr. Kambule to start us off. Dr. Kambule.
Thank you, Spa, and welcome and good afternoon to everyone who's a part of this session, our webinar.
Dr. Kambule, you've just gone mute and your camera's off. If you could please
Okay, and now?
Yeah, you're audible, but you're okay. There we go.
Okay, is it sorted? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much now. Yeah. So thank you to Spamandla, who is the Senior Office Facilitation Officer at the DDP. And I've been enjoying the relationship that I have with the DDP, particularly focusing on how we can improve the spaces in the local government sphere and how citizens can also impact on the development process that they engage in. And for today's session, I'll be basically focusing on key issues that are emerging within the new district development model as to what really necessitated the idea of bringing about a district development program or a district development model. And then from there on, we'll also look at some of the crucial underlying factors that have been at play in the South African local government sphere over the past 20 years, and how this particular model that has been announced by the president is going to help us get to the part that the National Development Plan has in plan for the South African constitution, and also for the citizens on their own in terms of the social and economic prospects of the country as a whole. So just to begin, I believe that majority of us are quite aware of the state of local government. And in most cases, it is the case that majority of the citizens are quite not impressed and they are not happy with the state of the local government sphere, whether it is in terms of delivering services or whether it is in terms of holding officials to account for each and every decisions that are taken at the local government level. So in giving about that particular space or that particular background, we understand that the South African local government sphere has two particular roles, right? And one of them is oriented towards human development, and the other is oriented towards service delivery. So if you understand the relationship between these particular two components, you'd realize that service delivery has an important bearing on the kind of human development that is going to be generated by a country. So, for example, if we look back to the developmental local government idea, this idea of creating a capable and also a local government that is committed to working with citizens has always been on the grassroots ideas that generated the democratic dispensation in South Africa. But then again, what we also need to understand is that moving forward with the new idea of a developmental local government that was created in 1998 through the white paper on local government, what we found was a particular system whereby majority of the municipalities in South Africa were unable to deliver services, right? So, for example, if you look at the report that was released by the South African president in 2015, it shows you that more than 78% of municipalities in South Africa were failing to perform all their 12 constitutional duties, right? So 70%, 78% is a high figure. And then in addition to that, again, you'd realize that more than 50% of municipalities were failing to perform more than half of their constitutional mandates, right? And that explains as to why do we have such a high number of municipalities that are under administration. So basically the service delivery process that we've been seeing in South Africa over the past 10 to 20 years are an indication of a local government sphere that is failing to deliver some of the developmental outcomes that will help improve the socio-economic conditions of the majority of the South Africans. And again, as we understand, more than 55% of the South African population lives in poverty. And local government, as the closest to all these socio-economic disadvantages that people are facing, is facing the greatest burden in terms of responding to the idea of how then do we create a capable local government that is going to address some of these fundamental developmental challenges that the South African local government sphere is facing, right? And that takes us back to the National Development Plan, which was adopted in 2012, right? So during the implementation of the National Development Plan, there were certain resolutions that are key that were taken, particularly focusing on Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan, which talks about creating a capable developmental state that is going to address the triple challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequalities, right, that is facing South Africa. But in doing so, there are certain fundamentals that we need to understand. The idea of a capable developmental state is an idea that is emerging from the Far East Asian tigers who were able to utilize the role of the state in advancing the socio-economic improvement of its people and also that of the economy. But in doing so, those particular states have served as the beacon of economic development or as the beacon of the kind of developmental progress that each and every nation aspires to. Having gone through that particular process, then the very question that we have then is, how do we then create such a capable state? As we understand, the national government is quite capable. The provincial government, to some extent, is quite capable. But then if we move lower to the local tiers of our government, we realize that it has been riddled by incapacities for the past 20 years. And that is why we are witnessing service delivery protests. And in most cases, these particular service delivery protests are turning violent. And they are also an indication of the lack of trust between the government and the citizen, right? So having gone through those particular phases, that is why the South African president in 2019 decided to come up with a better project of how do we then, as the national government, come up with a model that is going to address some of these fundamental flaws within the local government sphere, and that is through the new district development model. So just a brief background of the new district development model. So basically it is kind of a model that is based on a deconcentrated model rather than a decentralized or a fully decentralized model. And according to the presidency, this particular model aims to impact and improve the coherence at the local government sphere. And then secondly to that, it is also focusing on improving the delivery of social and economic developmental services to the broader community. And that is going to be utilized through the district and metropolitan municipalities. As we understand, again, the South African context, we have 44 district municipalities, and then we also have 8 metropolitan municipalities. So for the South African government, what they understand is that the traditional model of a fully decentralized economic development or service delivery vehicle within the local government sphere has not necessarily worked because of a number of issues. Some of them are linked to the lack of professionalization of the local government, and then some of them are also linked to cadre deployment and many other inefficiencies that are invariably impacting on the ability of the government to deliver developmental services, right? So what has been happening then is this particular shift to the new district model is basically targeted at addressing the disconnects that are evident between local municipalities within their planning structures. And again, it is also evident in the implementation phase, right? So as I've mentioned, if there is no capacity for local government to plan and implement projects, then you have particular issues, right? And those particular issues are likely to impact on the kind of developmental services that are given to the local government sphere. And an important question then that emerges is, but we already have district development model through the existing IGR framework, right? So that particular framework ensures that district municipalities collate all the developmental plans from local municipalities and integrate it into one particular model. So that's where the main point of contention is coming in from many of the critics of the new district development model, because it is basically a repetition of what the IGR format implies. But then again, there are certain ways in which we can also understand this district development model, particularly focusing on whether it can be successful or not, right? And that will be based on the ability of the national government to implement it through what we call a deconcentrated model rather than a fully decentralized model. And the main difference there is that a deconcentrated model is a model that ensures a stronger coordination between your national level and your local government level, and that could be largely achieved through utilizing the administrative and the vital resources that are evident, that are found within the national structures, right? So in going about doing that, the question then becomes, what is the role of co-production? What is it that citizens can do to actually ensure that the new district development model works? And in most cases, the answer is quite simple. the government needs to take people into account in implementing this particular district development model. Because what is the point of developing a new district development model if the government is going to alienate the very same people who are going to benefit from this model, right? And there is linked to the idea of ensuring that at the grassroots level, citizens play a leading role in terms of creating opportunities for themselves and also holding the local government sphere to account. For example, currently there's no consequences and accountability framework. That is why we are seeing such a high rate of corruption within our local government sphere. And that on its own also is impacting on the kind of developmental outcomes that we need as a country to generate. So I'll make one particular example. If you go to countries such as your Germany and your Sweden, you realize that local governments have much more power and they create more employment prospects than the provincial and the national government on their own, right? For example, if you look at state-owned enterprises in South Africa, they contribute a certain share to employment. But then if you go to countries such as your Sweden and your Germany, you realize much more employment. And in the South African context, then the question becomes, will you be able to replicate such a model through the new district development model? And the answer is that can only be done if government is able to address some of the capacity challenges that we are currently facing. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to any other questions that may arise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kambule, for managing your time so well. I think you raised some interesting questions, especially often what's sometimes touted from the policy side is that there's a lot of replication that seems to happen. There are policies that we have in place, but it seems somewhere along the way, the institutional memory of officials, councillors, government officials, and so forth doesn't seem to lead us to the right level. Earlier on, Aubrey Machitli was commenting on how we often comment on the good policy initiatives that government has. But of course, when he was saying that how do we judge whether we have good policy if there's no implementation of the said policy? So it's important that we start to look at some of those things as we continue on. Now to introduce the Vice Chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, Janet Love, for her presentation. And just before we engage with Janet Love's presentation, just a reminder that to please pose any questions that you may have on the chat section itself. And then further, there's a poll that's been launched. And the question for the poll is, what do you think of COVID-19 and its impact on the turnout for the 2021 local government elections? The first option is none. Turnout will not be affected. The second consideration is significant. Turnout is likely to be poor due to fears of contracting the virus. And then thirdly, it's unsure. Of course, at this point in time, we are hearing quite some good news from our American counterparts who are indicating that the availability of a vaccine, at least with them, is quite secure with two different service providers who are able to find vaccines that are 90% and above effective. So we hope that we in the developing world will also have access to those avenues. But of course, let me welcome again Janet Love. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks very much, Pamela, and it was just a pleasure to listen to Dr. Kambule. I think it was something that I'll try and link to at the towards the end of the presentation, because if we're looking at effective participation in the local government elections next year, we clearly are needing to look at that more holistically and not simply as just putting an X or a couple of X's on pieces of paper. So maybe just to give that kind of a background, first of all, if we look at the election timelines, in the light of the Constitution and the legislation in the Municipal Structures Act, we need to have elections taking place within a window period of 90 days. And the window starts on the 4th of August next year, and it ends on the 1st of November. And ultimately, the Minister of COGTA will determine the date after completing consultations with the Commission, which have already started. So then I thought it was going to be important when we're looking at participation in elections to look also at some concrete issues around numbers. So first of all, there's a perception that local government is somewhat, more simple than national and provincial government elections, but in fact, quite the opposite is true. If you look at national and provincial elections, we have 10 simultaneous elections. At the end of that, we elect 400 MPs and 430 MPLs, so a total of 830 individual representatives. For local government, we have over 4,500 simultaneous elections, and these include 8 metros, 205 local municipalities, and 44 districts. And in these elections, we elect almost 10,000 representatives in ward and proportional representation type of positions. So the complexity, firstly, of the electoral events that are happening simultaneously within each of the provinces is huge. I think the second thing around numbers that we need to have a look at is the numbers that are reflected in the way in which there are developments on the voters' roll. And the voters' roll, as everybody knows, is a reflection of who we have managed to connect with as a country, as an electoral commission, to ensure that they are registered. But importantly, the voters' roll also reflects issues about interest and commitment and enthusiasm of the demographics in our country. And again, I just wanted to say that we have a situation where the gendering of the voters' roll shows that you have 55% of the voters' roll being women and just over 44%, nearly 45% being men. Now, that statistic has been firming up over time and is consistent with slight variations for each of the provinces. Importantly, I think, is also numbers as pertains to the age of the voters' roll. Now, in terms of that age, you've got a situation where at the moment we are seeing the ages of 18 and 19 being really a very small proportion of the voters' roll, in other words, proportion of those registered, and the ages of 20 to 29 also being relatively low. This is notwithstanding the fact that the actual demographic in terms of the statistics that we have through Stats SA, that those two categories of ages should be a much greater proportion on our voters' roll. Now, looking then at the growth of the voters' roll, we've seen a significant growth of the voters' roll from 1999 to 2020. However, that growth had begun to taper off from 2019 to 2020. And clearly there are reasons for this, some of which would be related directly to mortalities, including those that arise from COVID. There are also indications that it's because, as people would imagine, every year, given that you have young people coming into the voting population each year, one hopes to increase the participation from that new cohort of young people. In fact, the increase that we would have hoped to have seen by this stage during 2020 has been checked in a very large extent by the fact that the ways in which we've accessed young voters have been held back by the impacts of COVID. So that's clearly an issue of major concern. So let's look at the current context that we are seeing. I mean, there is the context, and there's been some reference to this, that were, I'm sure, addressed very extensively in the first webinar of today, which relates to this topic, in relation to the fact that we're 20 years into our experience of local government, and as Dr. Kumbule has referred to, that notwithstanding the intentions and the programs and the conceptualization of that local government, there have been some serious falls and some serious shortcomings. In addition to that, also, I'm sure what was related to earlier on today, we've had incidents of corruption that have been at all spheres of government, but including very directly at the local sphere of government, and an inadequacy in our protection of whistleblowers. So there's a huge connection between political legitimacy on the one hand, which is undermined by things like capacity, by issues to do with corruption on the one hand, and participation in the electoral process on the other hand. And that is something that is very, very evident in our current context. Secondly, we have the impact of COVID-19, and I'll go into that much more. And then I'll end off with looking at some of the prospects for municipal citizen partnership to some extent in response to what Dr. Kambula has outlined in his presentation. So to give you some of the examples of the impact of COVID in the electoral cycle, first of all, we have challenges in terms of the legislative environment. So the idea that was discussed in the second webinar that the IEC decided to postpone elections is correct. I think the word decided to postpone is maybe not recognizing the fact that in levels 2 to 5, there are serious legal impediments that make the possibility of having an electoral event very difficult. And so to some extent, there are real impediments that the emergency regulations create. Secondly, in the planning and preparation for elections, you've got issues that need to be managed. On the one hand, there is the questions like sanitization, social distancing, masks, and the like, and I will refer to that in terms of the recent experience of by-elections. There's also levels of uncertainty. I think we are all aware that notwithstanding our hope that in the course of next year we have a rollout of vaccines, the reality is there's firstly no certainty about that, but secondly, in addition to that, right at the moment, we do have a continuation of infections and in fact an increase of infections, including in particular jurisdictions. And of course, at a local government level, this has got very critical impact on not just by-elections, but also on elections themselves. The third thing is the face-to-face engagements with stakeholders. Now, this is not only face-to-face engagements that involve the Electoral Commission and its staff, it's also face-to-face engagements that involve, institutions like DPP and faith-based organizations and so on and so forth, which can enable people to have the experience that has been so important, particularly in rural areas, peri-urban areas, and areas where issues like the availability and access to resources such as electricity, such as data, are huge areas for concern. So that's obviously a difficulty and a very big impact of COVID that needs to be factored in. Then we have voter registration activities that have had to be managed very differently, or in some instances halted completely. So, for example, the fact that tertiary institutions are gathering in a virtual manner meant that our targeted registration activities on each of the tertiary campuses had to be suspended, and so on. Then there are difficulties with observation. We were fortunate that we had some faith-based organizations and some civil society organizations during the recent by-elections come forward and indicate their willingness to participate in domestic observation, which is critical to ensuring and building confidence of local communities in election activities. And we would very much like that to grow. However, obviously for organizations that are part of the broader civil society ambit, these are also challenging times, and it's not very easy to mobilize. And then lastly, in terms of the outcomes of an electoral process, all of this that I've just mentioned as limitations that then do reflect themselves on participation rates and participation and engagement generally in the mandating and the questioning and the preparation of people to hold those people who are subsequently elected to account. So the Electoral Commission put in place a number of quite comprehensive measures during the voting process, including sanitizing, minimizing contact, wearing of masks, and so on. And our experience also enabled us to have a number of measures in terms of e-learning for the training of electoral staff, and also to create processes that used such kind of facilities as the one we're using now to try and overcome some of the difficulties. We have worked extensively on our e-learning platform. We are almost ready to launch our new website, which has a lot of components that will enable people to access information virtually, we hope with a lot more ease. But also we have been engaging in this kind of virtual way with a number of stakeholder groupings in the last couple of months. Now, all of this has been a response to COVID, and I think that what we're really wanting to emphasize is that it's a collective effort. It's a collective effort that needs to be continued, needs to be grown, needs to extend to the communication and education outreach programs of the Commission, but also needs to be able to support a host of activities, including this one, that are being carried out by other institutions. Our elections showed that the population, the voting population, was not unduly fazed, firstly by the threat of COVID, and secondly showed remarkable understanding and agreement to the measures that we put in place for everybody's protection. So finally, just 2 minutes to talk about the critical role of civil society. I think that earlier on, Dr. Kumbula was mentioning the importance of having capacity within local government institutions to plan and to implement, and the importance then of the partnership that is required from those institutions to the citizenry to ensure that citizenry can create opportunities for themselves on the one hand, but also can put in place opportunities for accountability. Now, all of that, very importantly, requires not just capacity of the local government officials and elected representatives, but requires capacity within civil society, not just capacity to know how to vote and how, what an election is all about and so on, but also to have the capacity to understand opportunities that exist in reality for the purposes of budgeting, for the purposes of planning, etc., and also opportunities that ought to be much more vigorously enforced within law for access to information, to ensure transparency, for opportunities that ought to exist in and are supposed to be covered in law to protect whistleblowers and to, in that sense, enable the kind of accountability. Now, it's in this space that although the Electoral Commission can play an important role in broad terms, talking about civic democracy and being participating and joining in those kinds of processes, but there's a huge opportunity and role for the broader training of capacity of our citizenry to be able to take hold of all of the opportunities that need to exist in terms of accountability. I'm going to leave it there and hand it to you. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for listening and the opportunity for this input.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for that input. I think it's important as well to just outline that there are a number of complexities that the electoral body deals with in the construction of its in the carrying out of its mandate, rather, and that there are a variety of opportunities as well available for input from civil society with the IEC. The IEC has a good relationship with a number of organizations in the carrying out of its mandate. So it's upon us both as citizens, but also as organizations working in this field of sort of building a more concrete democracy that we can better enable for the principles of democracy and the values of democracy to be lived experiences for all of us at various levels. So as we currently don't have any questions, I think the insights that you are both providing seem to be quite insightful to the extent that people don't seem to have questions at the moment. But I do have a set of my own based off of some of your presentations. Dr. Kambula, just perhaps for us to talk through, when we talk about co-production, what is the work that you see as sort of required from a citizen's perspective? So if I'm saying I want to co-produce in a certain segment of our society, or specifically at local government level, I want to work in collaboration with my local municipality. What is the work that necessarily I would need to start to initiate from my side in order to be able to have that happen? And what are the sort of responses that we anticipate from our local government? It might not always be the real thing that people get the necessary responses, but what should we be hoping to hear from local government as soon as a citizen or an organization, for instance, says, here's something that I would like to help build for our local community?
Thank you for that important question.
Okay, Dr. Kambule's network is currently giving him some problems, but we do have still with us Janet Love, who can be able to help us to engage a bit further on this specific issue. So, Janet, maybe just a slight review on last week's by-election process. What is the assessment from the IEC's perspective? How was that able to happen, and what are sort of the key partnerships that you had to initiate in order to, because I know there was a number of things that you would have needed from your side, including masks, sanitizer, and all of those protocols, especially under level 1. What are the things that you as the IEC were able to initiate in order to make sure that was a successful process?
Well, thanks so much for that question. And just to say that I think, first of all, there was actually a really strong cooperation from a number of our normal partners. And I include in that civil society organizations and faith-based organizations who, as I indicated, although in relatively limited numbers at this stage, and we do hope it grows, who committed themselves and took out time to engage in domestic observation. I think the second thing is that the numbers for these by-elections were generally within the ballpark of the numbers for by-elections that we've seen in the last 5 years, which mean that notwithstanding, and I don't only here talk about COVID things, also there is huge, as we know, difficulty, poverty, desperation of many people who've had to deal with the socioeconomic effects, not just the health effects of COVID, and the fact that there was that faith and that commitment to come out and participate in the elections, I think is something that we can be very proud of as a citizenry. Also, I think it obviously saw a lot of engagement by the political parties, by leadership within communities, including faith and traditional leaders. But I think that that's something also from our experience. We did have very big challenges, and I think these challenges are going to take us, are going to increase in next year's election with regard to diminishing resources. We've had to cut our budget already this year significantly, as have many other areas of the state. And, we've also got the additional expenses, for example, the protective clothing and so on. So let me leave it there as a general kind of set of observations. And I see that Dr. Kumbula is able to reconnect and hand back to him.
Thank you very much, Janet. Dr. Kambule, as we were talking, you were just disrupted there when you were trying to initiate a discussion around the role of citizens in sort of the co-production process. What are the things that need to be present? What are the sort of responses that we intend or hope to hear from our local municipalities?
Okay, thank you for that question. And thanks to Janet for just popping in there while I was away. So you've asked two important questions, right? And one is related to co-production, and the second one is related to how municipalities are going to receive that idea of co-producing with the citizens, right? I always refer back to the white paper on local government, which particularly talks about this very beautiful idea of a local government that is committed to working with citizens in addressing some of the developmental challenges and also coming up with solutions and social capital that is needed to ensure that our government is able to overcome some of the developmental challenges that it has been facing over the past 20 odd years or so. So in response to that, the idea of co-production is very important. I'll give you one particular example which has been thriving in China. Whenever we refer to China, for most people, we look at it as an authoritarian state whereby people have limited rights and all of that. But then again, there are certain examples that are emerging out of them, right? China is able to alleviate millions out of poverty each and every year, right? At most, they can alleviate more than 30 or 40 million people every year out of poverty. And in South Africa, if you look at the poverty rates, you'd realize that close to 30 million people live in sheer poverty. So in China, the local government sphere has been able to work with the non-governmental organizations in improving the capacity of the local government to deliver on some of their developmental services, right? And there is something that has not been prioritized in the South African landscape, right? And that is largely, again, due to some of the mistrust that normally occurs between the government, NGOs, and also the private sector as well, right? So what tends to happen there is the level of co-production is limited by the amount of trust that is available between the two or three bodies, right? And then enter the idea then of citizens co-creating certain ways of improving the way municipalities function, right? And I'll refer to one particular project that has been undertaken by the Human Sciences Research Council and the Department of Science and Technology. And that is largely related to using innovation to improve some of the service delivery problems that municipalities are facing, right? And it has been well received. And in most cases, it is only well received because it is from government to government. Now, what we are facing is the alienation of the citizens in the co-production space, right? And that is quite evident, as I've mentioned, it is quite evident in the service delivery process that we are seeing. So, firstly, co-production cannot happen if the local communities are not seeing eye to eye with the ward councillors. because ward councillors are there at the grassroots level. They're supposed to take some of the innovative ideas that communities are coming up with and presenting them in the councils. But they are not, because of the relationship that is there between the citizens and local government councillors, right? Or ward councillors. So that on its own acts as a key barrier that inhibits the creation of a co-production that is likely to generate new ideas of ensuring that government is able to improve its capacities, right? And then the second question was related as to how do we then go about in ensuring that government understands that we cannot govern on your own, right? You are governing people. So in governing people, you are supposed to listen to some of the ideas that people have, some of the plans that they have, some of the actions that they need to be they need to be taken, right? So, for example, if you look at IDPs, right, a big part of the new district development model centers on IDPs being collated at the district level. And in most cases, what we realize is that these particular IDPs are only acting as a wish list for municipalities. And in most cases, they do not consult with the local citizens. The only consultation that happens is a dialogue. There is one where municipal officials going to communities and telling them, this is what we plan to do. And as soon as that is done, they pack and leave. They do not necessarily engage with the communities to listen to some of the fundamental decisions that need to be taken, to understand as to how those particular places are supposed to develop, because at the end of the day, the knowledge is within or resides within the citizens. And that is the only way you can go about improving the developmental outcomes. For example, what is the point of a particular municipality? I'll just give you one example in Cape Town that they were facing. You'd realize that in terms of street lights, they will provide street lights that do not necessarily align with the needs of that particular environment, right? And that is largely based on the lack of consultation with the citizens as to what kind of street lights do particular communities need, right? So it is mostly based on what municipalities are planning and not what citizens are informing municipalities to come up with. So I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Doctor. You speak on some very key aspects about the nature of the, as Luyanda points out in our comment section, the importance of a functional relationship between communities and municipality. And he goes on to say, or he or she goes on to say, of utmost importance is for both parties to establish the trade-offs in that relationship in particular. Our poll question, or rather our poll results are out. For instance, the engagement with the question of what do you think of COVID-19 and its impact on the turnout for the 2021 local government election, the majority is thinking that it's likely to be significant due to fears. But of course, we hope that that's not the case, as we think that it's important that we have voters go out in their numbers to be able to cast their vote. Janet, just on this one in particular, as it relates to our second session that we had today on sort of public participation and political legitimacy. As you would note in some of our other democracies, the idea that electoral bodies specifically and their functioning helps significantly in the creating of that trust in the democratic process, as it were. We've seen, unfortunately, the sort of a decline in voter turnout since 1994 and up till now. And even when you look at the numbers comparatively between our national general elections versus the local government elections, the numbers, the differences there are also quite stark. And then if you look at also the consideration, as our poll is considering, potential impact of this lockdown, and just people then somewhat feeling that even when they do intervene through their vote, they don't necessarily feel that it's going to make an impact. What do you think for right now is your role in sort of establishing the level of trust that's necessary insofar as undertaking that when you do come through to cast your vote, it's going to be in a safe an environment for the purposes of that specific process. But then further beyond that is, what work do we need to start doing to ensure that people themselves do turn up? And in America, they do this process of mail-in voting. I know we're a bit far off, but what are the sort of processes that we can start to institute to ensure that even without the availability of these common spaces of meeting, or at least that there are fewer spaces, or that the spaces that are available can only accommodate a certain number, that we do create alternative mechanisms for people to vote. And this is quite a loaded question, but also as a last segment to that, we did note some issues last year in our national general election around people, of course, because in our national general election, people are allowed to vote outside of their province for the national government, as it were. But for local government elections, you would need to vote in your ward. There are always complications related to that, which also impacts voter turnout, I assume, because people generally sometimes can't get off work, or they work in a different province, and so they're not necessarily in the ward at which they registered for at the time of the election. What are the implications of all of this? I apologize for loading it up as much as I have.
No, I'll try to unpack some of that. I wanted to start though just with again sort of linking from this notion of co-production. You know, even in elections, not just in economic activity, the issue about information is completely critical. So if, for example, citizenry, and I use it as an example, have a sense of, you know, what is the business of the day of their municipal, of those who they've elected into their municipality, in a manner that is easily accessible for civil society organizations, for community radio, it means that there's an opportunity for them to have much more ability to monitor. Similarly, for elections, if one's looking at increasing participations, one of the most critical things is to ensure that we get young voters to be registering, and that's something that the IEC is certainly working at and has, you know, very targeted registrations and so on. But the IEC offices are open every day, you know, every weekday, and in all of the localities. In many instances, we rent space from municipalities, but other instances we have local space. Those people who are in those offices can register any voter at, you know, on any day of the week. Now, there needs to be a way in which that exercise of increasing our voters' role is something that we all take on board. Yes, absolutely. The IEC sees this as a core responsibility, but as we all know, that core responsibility is going to be enhanced by everybody contributing. What does that do in terms of confidence in an electoral process? What it does is it creates a constituency for that then is a powerful voice, a powerful constituency at the local level, that a municipal elected, somebody who's elected into the municipality, whether ward or PR, actually understands this is a very active area. I can't talk a lot of plans and ideas and so on, and people won't know what I'm talking about, because these people are active. There's a high proportion of very vocal citizens here. We have to be more vigilant. So it's that kind of interface that I think is really and truly critical. Let me just jump quickly into the issue about participation and participation levels. I think that it's been demonstrated time and time over our electoral period that the more we have new voters coming in who are being registered, that registration sees a much higher proportion of continuation to be part of the democratic process and to be part of the voice Now, young people, even with the limitations of access to data, access to technologies, and so on, young people have got huge numbers of ideas. And it seems to me that that is the kind of synergy that we need to build on, to give people the sense that those ideas will, on the one hand, as has been advocated in the discussions around co-production, be taken into account in terms of planning and so on. But those ideas are also taken into account in terms of the electoral platforms that people who come into a municipal election are putting out. So if you have somebody who's going to be standing for a municipal election who's promising in this kind of current context, notwithstanding the district system that's been that is being looked towards, but if you have somebody standing up and promising that they're going to build a dam, they're going to build a hospital, they're going to build a school, it's important that younger people are able to challenge that, to ask, how are you going to, where's that in your mandate, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's those kinds of sensitivities that will give people the understanding of what the job is, but also the basis on which to participate. And then a last thing around technology. Look, there are a number of technologies that are possible to introduce. We use technology, but we use it in a very confined way at the moment, because we're looking at what both is the reception of people, but also what is the financial basis to introduce technologies. Now, the voter registration device is something that we are in the process, as I think everybody knows, of finalizing an upgraded voter registration device. But the important thing about the voter registration process at the local level is that we run into problems when people who want to vote at a voting station, at a VD, a voting district that is not the one at which they registered, even if it's in the same ward, if we don't know in advance, and when I say we, I don't just mean the Electoral Commission, I mean we, the people, don't know in advance that here is a list of people who have applied to be voting in another voting station in their ward, or this is when we're talking about local elections. Now, that is one of the amendments that the Electoral Commission has proposed, which is currently before Parliament, because we believe that, yes, we would like to make it as easy and as possible for as many voters to vote where they in the appropriate place. In local government, it's very important that they vote in the appropriate place, and that there are no nonsense attempts, and they are all attempts at this stage, to vote more than once and to destabilize confidence in elections. Now, that involves two things. It involves a voter registration device that is upgraded, that will have a live feed on the one hand, in order to have those limits. But on the other hand, also it means that those people who registered at a voting station will be people who are on the ongoing voters roll associated with that voting station, or who have in advance of an election made application, so that everybody, the IEC, party agents, observers, the people at large, know that that person is voting once at the voting station that they're expected to vote. I'll hand it over for now. Yeah.
Thank you so much once again for that input. I think you make some really important points about the nature and the logistics around people informing in advance about their intention to vote at the other districts, specifically because of the confusion and the lack of trust it might create in the process itself. I was just thinking about also the impact of COVID-19 is that potentially it limits the amount of party agents that are deployed by different parties in order to monitor some of that, and what the potential implications are in terms of, because in the last election there were some issues that happened, but for the large part, my view of it was that I'm not sure in some instances, some of the smaller parties, if they were really, if the party agents themselves who were deployed to specific voting stations voted for the party that they were representing in that voting station. So the net effect then is you have a party saying, listen, we have so many people in this area, how can we not have an equal amount of votes in relation to that? But anyways, it was just one of those passing things. So Dr. Kambule and Janet, thank you so much once again for your participation. By nature of time, I'd just like to make sort of a last and final input around what levels of conversation. We've already heard from Janet in terms of the work that the IEC is doing to input to some amendments to legislation, and some of the work, and that those amendments are happening in parallel to the amendment of the Electoral Act in relation to national elections as it relates to independent candidates and so forth. So what's some of the work that we can start to undertake towards the local government election in 2021 to ensure that we have a swift and positive result at the end of it, specifically in relation to all of the issues that we discussed in this platform. I'll start with you, Dr. Kambule, and then we'll go to Janet.
Yeah, thank you, Spa. I think that's an important task. There's a conversation I had with a colleague last night, and it was specifically related to the idea of these independent candidates coming up and the kind of change that they are likely to make in the local government sphere. And I quite look forward to how the structure of the new election regulations will be when it comes to independent candidates for one particular cause, right? So whatever happens at a national level has an important bearing on the local government level, right? So if we are able to create a particular system whereby independent candidates can run successfully at the national level, and this does not necessarily mean that they win, but that they are able to get a number of votes that are sufficient for them to end up in parliament and increase their seats, then what we are likely to see is the local government sphere being slowly infiltrated by more and more independent candidates, because as far as we know, in most cases, independent candidates will often emerge from factions of certain political parties. They will not necessarily emerge just because they are there to represent the very interests of citizens, but they're just there to take votes away from a certain political party. So what I foresee is a particular system that is likely to be a game changer and give voice to more and more people, because what we'll see again is that people who have been active in the local government sphere, particularly some as who organize themselves as can be NGOs, it can be any other forms of civil society, they will have that avenue to say, we are going to run for a particular cause and we are going to get seats, and then ensure that the very people that we are representing or our constituents will be represented in those municipal councils, and whatever decisions are taken will then ensure that they feed back to the needs of our constituents. So I foresee a great escape for majority of those people who have lost hope in the number of political parties that we currently have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kambule. Janet, your closing remarks?
Yes, I think that people will lose hope whether or not they are seeing the overwhelming number of elected representatives coming from political parties, or, as we know, in local government, because we have 50% coming, including people who come as individual candidates. I think people lose confidence when there's a disconnect between any individual from the time that she or he is elected to the next elections. from a disconnect between those individuals and the people who cast their votes. And I think that's the critical issue. It's how we can ensure, and in this instance, political parties themselves, individual candidates themselves play a role through ward committees or through political party structures in ensuring that there isn't a disconnect. But importantly, civil society, faith-based organizations need to come on board to solidify that connection, because it's that connection that, you know, once the elections are over, it's that connection that will make a municipality or a province or whatever work or not work. So in a sense, we need to move to a point where we recognize that, yes, allegiances, political party bases, personalities will continue to play a role. But after an election, the duty is to perform. And, you know, this is where it needs to override those kinds of, if I can call them partisan kind of approaches. And that's a very difficult thing to do. This is why in our country, we're fortunate that we have robust civil society organizations. And, you know, I think that that's really the important role that organizations like DDP play. And, you know, all strength to you to continue. And I think that we hope there will be a very wide reach in what you do in order to build that confidence that people eventually after elections are elected to serve the people, regardless of who they voted for. And that's a concept that needs to be well understood.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. I think that was very important sort of note to end on, that partisanship stops at the point at which you're campaigning. But once you step into a role of governance, that you're actually doing the work on behalf of all citizens, regardless of whether they voted for you or not. I want to thank significantly yourself, as well as Dr. Kambule, for your participation and your patience with us as we got to this session. I also want to thank the participants for staying with us, even though we had some glitches with our second engagement. We want to assure that all three of our episodes or webisodes for today will be generating a YouTube link or a link for them for the recording, and you can have access to it at your leisure. The link will be sent either later today or earliest tomorrow morning. So thank you so much for your participation and your engagement. We thank Dr. Kambule from the School of Development Studies and Built Environment at University of KwaZulu-Natal, and also thank Jeanette Love from the Independent Electoral Commission, both for your time and your valuable inputs this afternoon, and we thank your participation. We'd also like to thank the Maid and Guardian, Juan and Sean, and the rest of the staff were able to keep us going, even with the technical difficulties. We thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their continued support of our work as civil society organizations in this space. And then finally, we thank the staff at DDP for all of their work in bringing this together. Thank you very much, and we look forward to engaging with you further as the year progresses. I think for us as a DDP, this is one of our last few activities for the year, and we hope that we can once again be in a space where we meet and able to shake hands and so forth post COVID-19, but also looking forward to a better 2021 in the space of building developmental local government, critical partnerships and value building for democracy across the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Spam.